This week, we have two amazing panelists talking about the topic of the new awakening in a post-pandemic world. And we're so glad that you're joining us from wherever you are in the world. Throughout today's conversation, please put your questions in a Q&A box. It's at the bottom of your stream. If you mouse down to the bottom of your Zoom stream, you'll find the Q&A box. Now, please allow me to introduce our panelists. First, we have UNICEF's Executive Director, Ms. Henrietta Fore. Ms. Fore became UNICEF's 7th Executive Director on January 1st, 2018. She has worked to champion economic development, education, health, humanitarian assistance, and disaster relief in a public service, private sector, and nonprofit leadership career that spans more than 4 decades. Secondly, we have Aspen Institute CEO, Daniel Porterfield. He'll be joining Ms. Fore today in conversation. Prior to coming to the Aspen Institute, Dan served as the president of Franklin and Marshall College for 7 years. This college was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1787. Under his leadership, Franklin and Marshall set records for applications, fundraisings, fellowships, and developed cutting-edge new centers for student wellness, career services, faculty excellence, as well as athletics. He has done amazing work at Franklin and Marshall, and he's doing even more amazing work here at the Aspen Institute. I'm very honored to call Dan a colleague. With that, Dan, please take the floor.
Thank you, Cordell, so much for that gracious introduction and for the leadership of you and your team in seizing the moment to ensure that we can host discussions like today's through the Socrates program with leaders that are making transformational differences in the world and with participants taking part in the conversation in a way that gives change makers access to other change makers so that we can all do our part to promote a free, just, and equitable society, which is really what the Aspen Institute is all about. This is such an incredible opportunity to be with Henrietta Fore. And Henrietta, thank you so much for the differences you make in the world, your advocacy for children, families, and communities, the incredible mission of UNICEF, which I think turned 75 this year. And it's an honor for us to be able to host you. And thank you so much for being here. Let me start by asking, are you yourself doing as okay? I know these are terrible times, and I hope you and your loved ones have been able to be safe together.
So Dan, thank you very much. We're fine. We have many of our people in UNICEF who are part of my family now that are not doing well. But it's a tough time in the world, but an interesting one, challenging, but filled with many possibilities.
Yeah, I hear you. And I feel the same way about the 450 employees of the Aspen Institute who are working so hard in their homes with multiple responsibilities, with caregiving, with the unusualness of not knowing when they'll be able to work again, and also with a tremendous amount of anguish right now that we all feel about what's happening in the country and the world. That's a burden that everybody's bearing and while trying to make a difference. And I really so respect leaders like those in UNICEF and those in the Institute. Maybe I can start by asking you to share a little bit about the role of UNICEF here at its 75th anniversary, and just what does the organization do today that the kinds of emergencies it's positioned to respond to? How do we understand its mission and role right now?
Well, Dan, thank you very much. And may I just give a salute to the Socrates program. I've watched it from its inception, and I'm so proud of where it is now and how it's grown and expanded, and it's a real gift. So thank you for doing webinars. So UNICEF began after the end of the last war, and it was the United Nations Children's Emergency Fund. And it was particularly to help the children in Europe. So after the end of the war, you could see that they needed nutrition, and they needed health, and they needed education, water, sanitation, protection. And so all of that became the basis for UNICEF. And you can see that it's actually built for times like this, when there is a crisis afoot in the world and that we could do something about. So we've got 15,000 people who are experienced and knowledgeable. We're in every country in the world, 190 of them. And we are participating in trying to get the right government programs, trying to get communication out to people. And in every sector, there is a need, and the world is looking at itself differently. So I think, Dan, one of the things that at least comes to my mind is that sometimes as Americans, we think that it doesn't matter beyond our water's edge, but it does. And Aspen embodies that with values-based leadership that crosses over boundaries. So what happens somewhere in the world is important to all of us. And that is what UNICEF stands for, and for the children, the opportunity of the future.
Thank you so much for that compliment to the Aspen Institute. And to our listeners, we're very proud that Henrietta has served on the board of trustees of the Institute. Whenever she's not in government, she's helping the Aspen Institute become its best self, which we're always trying to do every day in a new way. So you're leading this enormous, incredibly important global nonprofit organization, an institution in itself, and there's a lot to do with there. How do you establish priorities, and what are some of the priorities you have right now?
So Dan, it's a great question. It's also one for you for Aspen.
Yep.
So let me mention several areas that we really are caring about. So when 2020 began as a year, we thought that what we could be addressing is how to reach the Sustainable Development Goals in the next 10 years. So a decade of action for the United Nations. And poverty, inequality seemed to us one of the major issues. It's certainly one that you have championed. And so we began thinking in UNICEF, what could we be doing to make the world more equal for children? So that began us on a road, but then climate change came in. So a big, massive wave of important interest, especially for young people. So then we began moving with climate change. But then as COVID arrived, we knew that we had to add in 4 more areas. So let me just quickly tell you what they are. One is vaccinations. So we're extremely worried right now about routine immunizations for children. As you know, Dan, children need vaccinations before they're 1 and before they're 5 years old for all sorts of preventable childhood diseases. So everything from measles and smallpox and cholera and diphtheria and polio. If we can get children vaccinated, then we can save lives. We do not want to go back to where the world was 20 or 30 years ago. But what is happening is that families are afraid to bring their children in for vaccinations. And so vaccination rates are dropping 40, 60% in a variety of places around the world. So we're worried that we're going to lose more children because they're not getting vaccinated. So that's one. Second area we're focused on is we've got to get more water in the world. We are trying to encourage people to wash their hands with water, but there are so many places, particularly in Africa, that you cannot wash your hands. There is not a place to get water, to get clean water, and to get a bar of soap. So as a world, if we could get water to our world, it would be enormously powerful. Third area is digital online education. It's very clear that we are now in a once-in-a-generation opportunity to just leapfrog by getting digital education out there for primary and secondary school students. And we also need it for parents because a lot of them are becoming teachers at home. So digital online education to connect every school in the world to the internet and every learner to the internet. And the teachers will learn along with the students. And then fourthly, it's mental health. Mental health is going to be one of those unseen waves that's going to move through our world at a tempo that we have not yet seen. But the lockdowns, the lack of being able to meet with your school friends is having a real effect on children. There's a lot of anxiety and fear. There's a lot of violence at home. And children are very worried about their futures and they're getting angry.
Yeah.
So mental health is very important. So So those are our 6 areas that we're particularly focused on right now, Dan.
You know, I just am listening with so much respect for the priorities you've set. And I want to thank you because each one of those is directly relevant to needs in the United States. Directly. Sometimes we in the United States, I think, make the terrible mistake of thinking that the kinds of issues like vaccinations and early immunization or access to educational opportunity are challenges that other countries have or other regions have. We have enormous inequities in our society, only more exacerbated, as you know, by COVID-19, and more recently, the tremendous amount of societal anger about unaddressed structural racism and the constant barrage of difficulties faced disproportionately by communities of color. We have so much to do, and we can learn from UNICEF. And you've been doing this for years as an organization, making progress. Thank you so much. I want to ask a side question maybe about vaccinations, just because people are thinking about COVID-19. And I can imagine that when a vaccination comes, if there is one, or several, the delivery to parts of the world where there's great poverty is going to be a gigantic question. For the people that are listening today, is there anything we should be thinking about that part of it, the delivery to the most vulnerable communities worldwide?
Well, so Dan, this is going to be a big challenge for the world. And one of the keys will be these public-private partnerships, because much of the research and the development will be in the private sector. But those of us who work in this field, so for UNICEF, we are probably the largest purveyor of vaccines in the world now. About half the world's vaccines go through our doors, and it's because of childhood immunization. So we have cold chains that go out to the field into the hardest, most remote villages to reach. But what happens with that is that you need to have community workers who are in a village, are encouraging vaccinations, and that they have the trust of the community so that people will take those vaccinations. Oh. So right now, what people could do to help is join the public-private partnerships on the developing of the vaccines. Wherever possible, talk to your friends and neighbors about vaccines working, that they actually have saved millions of lives over these last years, and that we should all be protecting ourselves and our families and our communities, because this COVID is just overwhelming many of these countries. Yeah. I mean, we're so lucky in the United States. We have things like oxygen ventilators. We have countries that don't have one. Yep. So there is no chance for it. But it is a time when, as the world, in public and private partnerships, we can really help. We can change this. We can help with it. So anyone who can help out, public or private, donations are always welcome, but we would love to hear from any listeners, Dan, anyone associated with the Socrates program.
Thank you, Henrietta. You know, one of the things that the Aspen Institute does is it supports leaders and entrepreneurs who don't work for us, but are in partnership with us, have taken part in our programming or our fellowships. And some of them are colleagues who are working and from the exact communities around the world where they're partnering to try to make a difference. Peggy Clark leads our Health Entrepreneurs program, and she's got all kinds of colleagues that she's worked with in many countries who are right now setting up massive hand washing stations, for example, to get millions of people on a daily routine, or coming up with new ways to get clean water to people. And it's such an important fact, I think, for all of us to remember that people in the developing world are designing solutions that work. They're leaders on the ground making this difference, and we're not doing it for them, we're partnering with them. I'm sure that's the UNICEF approach.
Yes, and Dan, let me just add to that. The other thing that's different about this generation is they don't want to have things happen to them. They want to do it with us. So everywhere that we're working, we've got to have young people who are rolling up their sleeves and are partners. There are equal partners out there, and they're really excited about it. So they want to change the world, and so we should do it with them, Dan.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So let me ask you another question now. It's about the title of this discussion is A New Awakening. And as you think about that title, what is the new awakening that you hope we are bringing into being through UNICEF and through those that support UNICEF?
Well, one is that we're all connected. I think everyone's maybe thinking again about their own basic humanity. And it's something that the Aspen Institute does very well. It makes you think about the values that you honor out of your society and your education and what others around the world honor. And when you look at that, you begin to see that we are all connected and there is a basic humanity and that we should help each other.
Yeah.
So that, I think, is one of those new awakenings that Aspen can really help with.
Yeah.
A second one might be one that you had not focused on as much because it's not in the news, but it is that Aspen has this extraordinary tradition in the arts and in philosophy. It is a time when people are doing things differently. They're not scurrying to work because the transportation systems are down, or they're not in an office where everyone is distracting them. So art and philosophy have a chance to change one's hearts and souls and minds in a way that is more powerful than ever. So if I were in the Aspen shoes, it is an area that I would really think about how to reawaken and rejuvenate in this next generation. And then for us at UNICEF, I mentioned one that I think is going to be the most important for us, which is we are reimagining what education and skilling could look like. Young people today tell us that they are worried about several trends that are rolling through the world. One is demographics. In Africa, they know that the average age is about 20. It's massively young. It means that you think about a country and leadership differently than you do when you're in one of our older societies where the average age is 35 or 40. And what does it need? It needs a couple of things. They're saying they want an education that's modern, and that what they're getting is the last century's education. So that means that's ours, Dan. Yep. They feel it's past. They want it modern, they want it relevant. They also feel they need to learn some skills. They are very afraid that they're not going to be any jobs. And now with COVID, they're right. So 8 out of 10 are going to have to be entrepreneurs. They're going to have to learn how to make their own jobs. They haven't learned those skills in school, but they're going to need to. So we need to deliver that to them in an education system, either on their cell phones or in schools. That's going to be a responsibility for us. We also know that they feel that they need to have occupational skills. So to learn to be a motorcycle repair person or an installer of solar panels or a doctor or an engineer or a nurse, they need to learn how to do it. They're going to have to learn online because many of the schools are closed. And we have anywhere between 1.2 and 1.8 billion children out of school. And half, particularly the poorest, will not return to school. So they're going to have to learn other ways. And they're going to have digital skills. So you worry about the violence at home also. So will they have an environment in which they can learn? I think if we can get online digital learning going, that they can. So we're working with the satellite companies. We think lower satellites can connect every school in the world to the internet in the next 3 to 4 years. We're working with the cell phone operators to give zero cost to the downloading of any education curricula. We've been working with Microsoft and the University of Cambridge for something called the Learning Passport, which is, we originally created it for refugees and children that were on the move. Children for UNICEF is anyone below the age of 18. So it's primary and secondary school. So this learning passport allows you to learn using your national curriculum and textbooks. It's all loaded in your own language. So East Timor, Kosovo, they're starting to use it. We're very excited. Ukraine is using it. We think this could be a platform that can roll out to countries everywhere, and then look at all the digital online content from edX and Coursera and Khan Academy and Aspen Institute. We load it, it's available for schools and young people, and we can leap this generation into a time of equality and a time of education that will be like no other. So that's our reimagining of education and skilling, and we think it's very exciting. We want to come out of COVID stronger, and Dan, we could use help.
Yep. What a vision. That is, it's beautiful, inspiring, and it's graspable. It's possible. This is a moment to think about scaling things that work using technologies that can be, if universally available, can bring the gift, the transcendent gift of learning to everyone. We at the Aspen Institute have a lot of different things. I won't get into the details that are relevant, but one is, and you may have been involved in improving this when you were on the board, we have our Stevens Initiative, which is led by Mohammed Abdul Qadir, through which we're providing digital learning experience and connectivity between students in North Africa and the Middle East with students in the United States. And we'll be looking in time to see if we can continue to develop that model in other parts of the world. And there's tens of thousands of students, though, in this early work that our Stevens Initiative staff is doing. If you were on the board and approved it, thank you. I'm the lucky beneficiary of getting to be inspired by it. And I also would just say two other things that are so relevant. One is that we have a program that is called the College Excellence Program at the Aspen Institute, which is all about promoting successful community college experience, meaning students learn skills, they get propelled into opportunity, the opportunities are family sustaining jobs. And the way we've really developed that program, it's about nurturing and supporting leaders that are at the local level to help local leaders running these community colleges to see what's possible. And that connection of promising practices and solutions, making that available to more, seems like one of the roles we can play, but that any people-serving organization can play in this time. And the last thing I wanted to say, it was just so beautiful the way you talked about what can happen to when young people believe that they can create their future. That's a mindset shift that leads to entrepreneurship. That belief that you have the power to be a learner and a creator and a contributor is really what I hear you saying UNICEF is all about. That's a new awakening, that belief. That to me is what we should all be about. How do we help the young know that they are the creators of their lives? And thank you for all you do with that.
Yeah, yes, exactly. So, so number one, I was definitely involved with the Stevens Initiative. Yeah. It's brilliant. I mean, all of the Aspen programs are the kinds that have shown that there's a good way of doing things. It's a good practice that we could scale up around the world. So Dan, consider this an invitation. Scaling, that's what the world needs. We need to reach millions rather than thousands of children. And
Exactly.
and then to your point about young people, that sense of empowerment, the sense that I can do it, or you mean you'd let me do it? You mean I could do that? That's what we want them to feel. What's happened now is that they feel a bit that the world is closing off to them. There aren't going to be any jobs. They're not allowed outside. They're not allowed with their friends. They're not going to be able to meet anyone, and that their world is shrinking. So we need to open it up so that it looks like it's filled with all the opportunities and possibilities, and they can dream about what lies in the future because they are our future. And as a result, if we can empower them, and Dan, if I may say, particularly the girls, that will make a massive difference in our world. So,
Yep.
yes.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. We at the ASP Institute are doing strategic development of the next bigger initiatives, which include thinking, how do we scale what's been successful? And we have a group that's formed of 8 program leaders and 5 trustees that's working on this question. What can the Aspen Institute do even more to engage, inspire, include, and empower rising generations around the world? We really believe that that is one of the imperatives of this time. And thank you, because you're going to be one of the inspirations for us in your agenda. Thank you so much.
Assume we're putting up our hand at UNICEF. We're
Exactly.
delighted to be a partner for scaling it. So
Thank you.
go, 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 go.
So if I may, I'd like to read you a quote from Nobel Peace Prize winner and former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. There is no trust more sacred than the one the world holds with children. There is no duty more important than ensuring that their rights are respected, that their welfare is protected, that their lives are free from fear and want, and that they can grow up in peace. And I think that as we bear witness to the challenges today, so many, on this theme again of the young, how should we think about the rights of children?
So Dan, this is a deep and fascinating subject, but simply it is that children have rights, and sometimes we forget about that. There is something called the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it has passed its 30th birthday. It has been accepted by so many countries around the world, and it really outlines what are universal and perennial rights for children. And one of the many things that it says is a right to a good environment, a right to an education. And for many children, this is beyond their reach, but it's not beyond our reach. So how we should think about it is that it's our responsibility and our legacy that we deliver on those rights for children. They can advocate, they can be our partners in achieving them. They would love to be part of designing the solutions, and so we should do that with them. But it's our responsibility to make sure that it's available to every child, everywhere, no matter who they are, no matter where they are. They just need our help.
Yep.
So thank you for bringing up child rights.
Thank you. And I apologize for not being sure, but I don't think the U.S. has signed that agreement on the rights of the child. Am I right about that?
Not yet, Dan.
Right.
So you still have work to do.
There's work to do, exactly. And one of the things that I love about the discourse of rights is it allows people to share visions of what they hope for through the lens of what should be guaranteed for each and every person. And then when we talk about, well, how do we justify our belief in rights? It allows us to talk about our deepest values, whether they're religious values or perhaps values about the way civil society or secular society works, or how families and cultures inculcate beliefs and values. That rights can be almost a doorway through which we walk to get to know one another and to be able to understand one another, and then to act on that understanding to make an actual difference, to bring the rights from theory into reality, into practice. Complex topic, I know, complex. But is that consonant with how you understand rights?
Yes. Rights are very complex. So Mortimer Adler would probably have maybe a different approach than many of the officials who are presidents and prime ministers in the world. But some rights we feel a person is born with. Other rights are given to us by governments. So let me give you an example. There is a sense now that perhaps it should be a child's right to have access to a digital online education. It was not thought of before. Right to an education, yes, but maybe. So we evolve as a world, and we do it based on the values that we have in our own societies, but in our sense that equality and inclusion means that we would wish what we have that we find beneficial to be available to others so that they can have access and affordability for whatever that right is. And so it's a very interesting exploration intellectually and as an individual in your own heart and mind, but it is a very important one as a world as we think about COVID and what the rights should be for children coming out of COVID.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much. I hope that our listeners are feeling the same like uplifting sort of like movement inside of them that I'm feeling in hearing you express these values in such a way. Maybe I'll ask one more question, and then we can, Cordell can come back and he can invite those that are attending to ask you some questions. And it's just a question that's kind of like from our ideal or yearning for the ideal, and then the reality that the world is in an uphill climb right now. We've got a lot of problems, and I won't recite them all because we know them. We know them, and we're in fact, many are reflecting on them right now, every day, thinking, what can we do? What can we do? And I guess my question is about the building of a future that protects the planet and protects health and protects rights for all, but I'm thinking again, the young, the how-to part of it. Is that too big of a question to ask? How do we try to move forward?
Questions are never too big to ask. So at least for me, I think that entities like a UNICEF that are out working in the world are useful as partners because we see the world in all of its diversity. Countries are not the same, villages are not the same, households are not the same, but we will touch all of them at one time or another. So how do you move forward? You move forward with partners who are at work in the world. And some are corporate partners, some are civil society organizations, some are just another family somewhere in the world. But ideas can spread like wildfire. But operationalizing them, making sure that they actually get done, like your earlier comments about vaccines, is something that you need partners to work with. So when you have an idea, put together a good team of partners. Go gather 5 young people and 5 older people and start setting about operationalizing it. And we'll be there to help, right by your side, Dan.
Thank you so much, Henrietta. And as I turn back to Cordell, I want to just quote our trustee and the former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, who is such a leader, who the other day I heard her say, the older I get, the younger my mentors are. That same spirit of partnership together, young and old, creating a world that we who are older may not see, but will have helped to shape through our investment in the young. Cordell, would you like to open up the floor?
Absolutely. Open up the floor for questions from the audience. I have a few in the box right now, one for you, Ms. Fore, and one for Dan. Ms. Fore, in working with your amazing team at UNICEF, especially Ms. Blair Palmer, I've learned that you all are part of this greater constellation of UN-related organizations. And I wonder, for the good of the order, if you just can explain that constellation, because it was brand new to me. I had no idea what she was talking about. But explain that to folks who may not be familiar, and UNICEF's exact role within that constellation.
Thank you, Cordell. All right, so there is a constellation. So UNICEF is part of the United Nations, And so I, as the head of UNICEF, wear two hats. One is that I am part of the senior team for the Secretary General. And so in that role, the Secretary General is working on peace agreements everywhere in the world. So it could be Libya or Yemen or South Sudan, but we hope for a world that is peaceful, and we hope for a world that is prosperous and a world that is equal. So that's one hat. The other hat that I have is that I run an agency, in this case, UNICEF. And there are a whole nother group of brother and sister agencies. So everything from the World Bank, the IMF, the UN Development Program, UNHCR for the refugees, the World Food Program, WHO. These are all my colleagues, and we all try to work as a team out in the world in every country. And we are there to try to help the country governments more effectively look after their people. And we bring together public and private friends to do so. UNICEF is one that works in both humanitarian emergencies and in development, longer term. Some of the agencies are just humanitarian, some are just development, but we all work together, and it is a constellation that is yours to tap into and to put to work.
Great, great. Thank you. Thank you for that explanation. And Dan, there's a question from Mr. Gisela about there's a bill in Congress to expand the AmeriCorps. And I'm thinking specifically of some of the programs like the Steve Patrick and others within the Institute League. But his question to you is, how can how can the public leverage Aspen's best practices as it relates to service and young people to encourage Congress to expand funding for AmeriCorps?
Thank you for that question. And so a number of our programs work in different ways with young people or with schools or with colleges. And all of those programs are unified in their belief that young people should be supported in their desires to contribute to society. And that support includes their education, investment in service opportunities that ideally are reimbursed. I don't mean volunteerism, although I'm not opposed to volunteerism, but that allows a young person to make a difference and be able to afford to live while doing it. And then also all of our programs are unified in the belief that it's particularly important with vulnerable youth to provide opportunity structures now to make a difference now. I think there's a big argument to be made about definitely increasing the size of AmeriCorps. I speak as somebody on the board of Teach for America, the national organization where students, young people worked for at least 2 years, facilitating educational equity. Definitely a need for that. Also, complementary, a need to be aware that many college students who have come from modest or low-income backgrounds are not going to be able to go back to school in the fall for a variety of reasons, and they need something to do. And we have needs for things they could do, which can include individualized tutoring, working on contact tracing, helping to help communities find a way to open up their businesses in a way that allow for social distancing. So we're really calling for that too, that as part of the effort to help higher education cope with the tremendous disruption, that we not forget that there are many, many low-income students that would like to go back to college, but actually are going to need to work for a year or two because their families need them close or because they can't see themselves going back where they went right now. But we've got to give those young people opportunity. And so I do see service as opportunity, as investment. It should be related to students' educational aspiration. I don't tend to view it as volunteerism, although I support volunteerism in its many forms, but I think we have to make it possible for young people to earn some money and educational investment while serving. And thank you for the questioner implies support for the idea of expanding AmeriCorps. And though we're not able to take political positions or lobby on particular bills, definitely we need more opportunities for more young people to be able to be in service roles right now.
Great, thank you, Dan. And I also add for the listeners that our colleague and vice president of the Aspen Institute, Steve Patrick, has an article in the Aspen Times yesterday about this very topic.
Yeah.
And his recommendations was to increase the stipend so that low-income students can better participate in this program without taking a loss to do it.
Yeah.
Right now, it's people subsidized by their parents taking advantage of this amazing opportunity that is AmeriCorps.
Yeah.
So, Ms. Fore, I have a couple questions for you. One is from a dear colleague in Marcia Rawls. Marcia Rawls is in DC, and she was part of that first class of Socrates participants in the mid-90s. So I'm always happy to see Marcia, and is still active in our program. It's fantastic. So she is leading a global effort of 14,000 entrepreneurs, and she's asking them to use their business for good and align with the 17 UN SDG goals. Her question is, how can I empower all members to create impact?
So, Marcia, this is a wonderful puzzle. We need scale. So, if members would be willing to come in beside some of the initiatives that are moving at big scale around the world, we could really use their help. If you go to generationunlimited.org, you will see one of them that is a big public-private partnership that wants to move to scale. It's moving right now in about 20 countries. We need to move strongly in those 20 countries, but we also need to move worldwide. And we can work in every area. Since we touch every area of a child's life, everything. So we can use people who are interested in nutrition, or people that are interested in protection or technology, artificial intelligence. We can use everything. The second is, just to build on Dan's earlier thought, sometimes a young person needs just a mentor, or they need to be able to do some work. It doesn't have to be a full-time job that isn't there, but if they are given some work, they are given credit, they could put it on their resume, and they have a mentor who can help them think about it, it would make a big difference. So if any of your network would be willing to be mentors, I think young people would just adore it. Thank you.
Thank you. And another question for you. This is coming off of your comment that UNICEF is all over in every continent. As a large organization, and during your time as executive director and the work across the world, what has profoundly struck out for you? What have you seen that was remarkable in your time as executive director, and perhaps compare that to your time as USAID administrator?
Well, okay, I'm going to go on to the dark side here. I have dreamed that the world might be more peaceful, but instead what we have are conflicts that are simply dragging on. So whether it is Yemen, 5 years into a war, Syria, we are nearly 10 years into a war, all of these conflicts last longer, are deeper, and are much more brutal than they ever were. Somewhere in the world, a child is killed by violence every 7 minutes. When you really think about that, you realize that our world is so violent, and it takes away from the possibilities of the world. So I guess one area that has struck me is that we are not catching this this fever for peace. We instead allow conflicts, create conflicts among countries, within countries, and we should be a more peaceful, prosperous, and equal world.
And Dan, related to that, there's another question from Mr. Petcove. How can we rekindle our primordial understanding that we are all connected, and remember that which connects and unites us all is that we're on this critical path towards respect, peace, and compassion?
That may be the planet-saving questions of the day. Thank you for asking it. I think that we as human beings have the potential for empathy, and we have the potential to see the world through the lives of another, and to try to see through the world as others are living it. We have to cultivate that. It may be in some sense natural, but in some other sense, it's a practice. And through the connections that we have with those that are our immediate loved ones, we can remember that others have those same connections. Or through the feelings we may have of despair and pain, when we lose something precious to us, we can remember that others too have those feelings. And those moments when we feel defensive or fearful, we can remember that others who appear to us as defensive or fearful are having those feelings that we have too, that they are us and we are them. Maybe this sounds too philosophical, but I believe it's through understanding our own humanity and our human frailty that we can cultivate our empathy with others. That if we can accept our fear and our flaws, our self-regard, and then not become egotistical about that and sort of hate ourselves, but rather say this is part of being human, with our capacity for love and for sharing, for open-mindedness, that those two things together can give us a chance to feel a connection and then act on it. And it's the acting on the connection that reinforces a further yearning to feel it. So there's my thoughts. I'm not a poet or a person that is a philosopher. There's common sense thoughts. I hope that's a help.
That is very helpful. And, that spurred in me another question for both of you. And we'll start with Ms. Fore. And especially Ms. Fore, because you're on every continent, whereas Aspen is on 4. We are having some very interesting conversations as a human society right now, where we're questioning our very foundations. Equity in all its shapes and its forms is being questioned in our organizations in a variety of forms. I can certainly speak to what's happening at Aspen. It's a very robust dialogue that Dan will get into in his answer. But I wonder, in your context, where you're on 196 countries, where you may have 196 different definitions of equity, how are you leading or facilitating these really interesting and thoughtful and passionate conversations within your organization?
Thank you, Cordell. It's actually a very interesting investigation that you propose. So around the world, as we know at Aspen, values can be very different in various societies. And it is one of the joys and one of the challenges for UNICEF that we try to encourage some amount of universal values. So equity is in our strategic plan as UNICEF. And equity is in the United Nations and in the Sustainable Development Goals that we are all moving toward. But every country and every part of country can view that quite differently. But our people are nudging, guiding, helping to plan, discuss, bringing groups together to try to come to that understanding as a society as to what are the values, how do we create equity in our society, how do we give hope to everyone and inclusion for everyone. We were just talking about some of the street children in Africa. It is extremely important that everyone, whether they are in or outside of a society, feel part of it, that they are not left behind by societies. And for many of us, like UNICEF and children, you just don't want anyone left out and left behind. So we're working very hard on it. We have lots of discussions on it. And Cordell, we'd love to see you engaged in them.
Yes, yeah, please count me in. Dan, please.
Well, I think that one of the things that we've done in the last couple of years is we've had the beginnings of a conversation around how do we understand the mission and vision of the Aspen Institute for the world we live in today. And through a set of conversations with staff, all staff invited, through some surveys, through interviewing of our partners, through discussions with our board members, we came to see that a clearer expression of our identity at this moment of time is as follows, that our purpose is to drive change towards a free, just, and equitable society. That statement didn't just come out of my head. It came out of collectivity, of lots and lots of dialogue and listening in the organization. And it was, I think, energizing for many in the Aspen Institute who saw themselves as driving change and had been doing that for a while, but hadn't heard that language in the positioning of the organization. They had heard the language of convening, which is extremely important as a part of how you drive change. They hadn't heard the idea, let's drive change. And towards what? Towards these, admittedly, terms that need to be reinterpreted, but free, just, and equitable society. They need to be reinterpreted. They aren't self-evident. They require care and dialogue, but also action. That's a step, but it's not a completion. It's a step. And I think we as an organization will be undergoing a similar set of conversations that are so critical for the internal community to say, what does equity mean both in our work, but also to us as employees? How do we understand the Institute's many different tools in its toolbox of change making and how they relate together? And can we hold ourselves accountable for driving change, both internally and externally, and not just saying we want to drive change internally and externally? So that's a start. But I also think any great organization should always have that set of questions on the front burner, even as it's working, because we're always acculturating new people into the organization, and the world we're working in is always changing. And so we have to be open and agile to changing how we work and how we invite new members into partnership and into colleagueship. And so we really have a lot we still need to do to be the best we can be at driving change towards that kind of society.
Fantastic. And this will be the last question. As you know, the Socrates program focuses on emerging leaders. And I'll start with you, Dan, because I want Ms. Fore to end it. To the 30-something-year-old professional that's looking at you, seeing what you're doing, and they want to be you, what would you say to a person that would get them on a path to leading an organization like the Aspen Institute? And the same for you, Ms. Fore.
So I think be authentic to yourself is the critical thing we all have to do as human beings. It's a journey to try that. That's most important. Secondly, I think that it's hard to know, to plan a path, but is what you're doing, does it align with your values? Because if you know your values and whatever you're doing aligns with your values, it will bring a feeling of joy, even if the work itself brings pain because of the challenges. But ultimately, the alignment of our values with our actions brings a kind of a sense of joy that is its own justification and is nourishment for the next stages of work. And then third, I would say, you can't plan a job for the future, but you can feel, are you moving directionally in the directions that call you? And I would want that for every person, that they could feel that sense of directional coherence. I want to hear what Henrietta has to say, though. You probably have something better.
That was pretty great.
Yeah, no, Dan, that's very good. That would speak to me. So I'll be a little bit more specific. I think what you need is a good liberal arts education, if you can.
Yes.
Be broad so that you can see all of the aspects of a life. If you can, try to serve in business, in government, and in the nonprofit world. They are all different, but they interact and interweave in a way that you will love. Then for me, I thought it was important to make the world a better place. And if you carry that inside of you, you simply will do it. You'll do it for the rest of your life. And I have found great joy in it. I've never wondered about what needed doing. I could see that there was lots of work that needed doing. And that's also important, that you don't wonder, why you're here. Is life meaningful? You see the joy of getting something done. And then lastly, it is, I would volunteer. Volunteer everywhere you can. If somebody says to you, would you like to come join me and help on this, a food bank in your local community, say yes, do it. And once you begin volunteering, you never know who you meet. You never know what jobs happen. But if you want to work for UNICEF, we have UNICEF volunteers right now. We also have them out around the world, and I'm sure we'll open up again for hiring. But there's a big wide world out there, and we need every one of you.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. I normally am not moved emotionally during these webinars, but today is that rare exception. I'll forever remember doing what you love will bring you joy and pain. I'll always remember that. Thank you for that, Dan. Thank you, Ms. Fore, for joining us today. You're only running part of the world, and you have to join us. So I thank you so much. And I also thank you for being part of that founding cohort of trustees that helped launch the Socrates program 24 years ago. I am a direct beneficiary of your generosity, so thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us again this week. Next week, we will have Dean Evans of the LBJ School of Public Service and Larry Norden of the Brennan Center for Justice talking about election security. And the following week, we'll have two psychiatrists in New York that have both suffered from COVID talking about dealing with COVID personally and treating others in New York with COVID. Thank you all so much. This video will be available on our website. But until then, we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.